All right, well, I've been fact-checked. So after I just did the news and said, hey, we got a full Kids Zone on Wednesday, I am wrong. We got infants and preschool on Wednesday. So elementary students, you're so welcome here to have you. So come out to Ash Wednesday. That's my official apology as well. I'm sorry. Okay, so open your Bibles with me. We're going to be in Exodus chapter 5 this morning. Looking at a conflict that Moses is going to have with Pharaoh. You know, there's two common reactions to conflict. On the one end of the spectrum is avoidance. Like you just wish it wasn't there. You want to sweep things under the rug. As a recovering people pleaser, this is kind of the tendency that I've had to overcome. I just hate telling people stuff that they don't like to hear. So it takes me a minute. You know, I always had to overcome that. You know, on the opposite end of the spectrum is people that when there is a conflict, they just head straight towards it. My wife is one of those kinds of people. And it's not like they enjoy having conflict. They just know that when something comes up, there's no way around it. You just got to face whatever it is. So this kind of works out in our marriage in specific ways, and one of which is we've decided that when it comes to calling customer service to resolve problems, my wife is the one that we send in. And here is why. A little while ago, there was an internet service we're paying for that they said it was going to be one price. They start to raise it over time. And so we're like, this is ridiculous what we're paying for what they told us we were going to pay for this. So I call in and I say, hey, this is what you told us. This is what we're paying. Like, what can we do to fix this? And they're like, oh, I'm sorry, that sounds bad. Well, there's nothing we can do. And I was like, okay, have a great day. Goodbye. You know? And so then I go and I report back to Annika, and I'm like, yeah, they said there's nothing they can do. And she's just like, she knows me. She's like, did you give them like any pushback at all? And I was like, they said there was nothing they could do. So she calls. She's like, how much longer, Lord, do I have to be with this guy? No, so she calls in, and so I proceed to get this master class on this is how you call customer service. So she gives them the same information as me, but as soon as they say no can do, she starts pushing back with some questions, always very kind to the representatives on the line. One of my favorite phrases I heard that day was, you didn't create this problem, but I need you to fix it. I was like, that's a good one. I'm writing that down, you know. And the zinger was this. She goes, I am unhappy right now. What are you going to do about it? I'm like, that's my girl right there. I was so proud. And she gets results too. We paid nothing for a couple months until we got that reduced rate instilled. And so she got results when it comes to conflict. And so this is what we're going to be looking at today as we start this Unchained series, Learning to Live Free. This is going to officially kick off next week as we start Lent. But today serves as a bit of an introduction to our series. And so this whole thing is going to be following the Israelites through their 40 years in the wilderness because they've been enslaved to the Egyptians. And so they have to learn how to live free as the people of God. So that means for you and I, as we go with them on this journey, we are going to be living what it looks like to live into the fullness of God's freedom for us. And so here's the good news for you and I today as we start this journey, that God has an escape plan for your freedom. He has an escape plan for you. Whatever you find yourself in today, whatever bondage you are dealing with, you are not left to your own devices. God is at work on your behalf. But for those of you that are like me and are conflict averse, I've also got some bad news, which is that there is no freedom without confrontation. That's what we're going to find today. There's no freedom without confrontation. And so I want you to just kind of think of, in life, where do you feel stuck? Like, what's a holding pattern that you just feel like you've been in perpetually and just haven't been able to get out of it? You can't even imagine what it would be like to live in freedom, in God's freedom in that area of your life because you've been dealing with it so long. It can be a particular mindset. It could be like a vice in your life. Sometimes it can be things like toxic thought patterns where you're just constantly second-guessing yourself, putting yourself down. It can be unchecked ambition and greed that just kind of sours all of your relationships and rots your soul. Like it can be something like that. It can be a revolving door of relationships, and all of them just kind of toxic people, and they all have those. You kind of discover this at some point every time in that relationship. Or maybe you just kind of have this mindset that's very escapist in nature, where you need a substance or a screen so that you can cope with life and feel okay. Now, some of us, we've been following Jesus our whole life, and we don't even know what it looks like to live in freedom fully from a particular area that we might have been chronically struggling with. And so we might even tell ourselves things like, oh, no one's perfect, and just my cross to bear. But we are settling for the status quo instead of chasing after the fullness of what God promises us. And so how do we break these patterns? It's through confrontation. And so let me just set up what's going on in this passage and some of the context here. The Israelites, they have been enslaved for 400 years under the oppressive hand of the Egyptians. And God, as we've found the past few weeks, he hears their cry. He's got an escape plan for them. That's Moses and Aaron. And so God originally calls Moses. Moses gives God a ton of pushback. He's just like riddled with self-doubt. Can't imagine facing Pharaoh because he just feels like, how am I going to move someone so deeply entrenched? This is hundreds of years we're talking about right here. But here we find today, in Exodus 5, he has embraced his call. The tail end of chapter 4 is Moses and Aaron coming to the Israelites and the elders, and they explain to them, God's got an escape plan for you. Like, he's heard your cries. And so the people, they're filled with hope. They're worshiping God at the end of chapter 4. And today we're going to find they get a little frustrated. They're going to have to learn that things don't always happen on their timeline whenever God is in charge of it. Like, freedom comes not always in the ways that we might think. And so even Moses, his hesitation about facing Pharaoh, we're going to find out this is really warranted because this guy is really tough. And so actually, Bible scholars point out that Pharaoh is kind of treated as this archetype of evil in Exodus, meaning like he's not even given a name at all. Like, we don't know Pharaoh's name. And so all this to say, evil changes forms but doesn't change tactics. And so what we're going to learn about is kind of like this bigger battle that you and I are involved in that Pharaoh is really representing here, because he represents a lot about our spiritual enemy, Satan, the accuser. And so as we read about this, we're going to be learning how we face our enemy as Moses has this showdown with Pharaoh. So Exodus 5, starting in verse 1. It says, afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go so they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness. Pharaoh said, who's the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. He's like, Yahweh who? I don't know this guy. Verse 3, then they said, the God of the Hebrews has met with us. Now let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God, or he may strike us with plagues or with the sword. So this description that Moses and Aaron are giving, it would register with Pharaoh, because Pharaoh, like in this time, the concept of God or the gods is that if you don't do what they tell you, there's a lot of repercussions for that. And so Pharaoh has a lot to lose here. He could lose his entire workforce. Like, that's what's on the line for him. But verse 4, he said, but the king of Egypt said, Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their labor? Get back to your work. Then Pharaoh said, look, the people of the land are now numerous, and you are stopping them from working. In other words, stop messing with my bottom line here. Verse 6, the same day, Pharaoh gave his order to the slave drivers and overseers in charge of the people. You're no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw, but require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota. They're lazy. That's why they're crying out, let us go and sacrifice to our God. Make the work harder for the people so that they keep working and pay no attention to lies. So Pharaoh here, he's just showing us how our enemy operates. And so as we learn this, I can encourage you, if you got your journal out, you can take notes on page 8. And this is what we're going to be learning about today, is how the enemy works with us, how these slave drivers operate. And so here's what I want to just start by recalling is what happens at the opening of Scripture in Genesis, the opening pages. God creates this good world. He creates humanity in his image, and he puts us in his good world to steward it. So in other words, God creates work as a good. It's a created good. But the enemy operates in such a way that he takes the good things that God creates and uses them as temptations for it to become like the end-all be-all in our life. And so we just find ourselves stuck, and it's impossible to enjoy these good things God has given us. Like, have you ever had a time where you meant to do something that was like good or fun, and then other people just kind of made it impossible to enjoy? Many dads may know this pain today, right? You're out on a family vacation, and you tell the kids, hey, we're going to go on a family hike. This is going to be super fun. And so you go out into the woods with your kids, and like 15 minutes in, they're like, my legs hurt. I just got bit by a mosquito. When are we done with this? And the dad that was like super pumped at the beginning is like now turned into a crazy lunatic. He's like, no one talk to each other at all. Like he's biting everybody's heads off. Why? Because they've made this impossible to enjoy, right? And so this is the first thing that we learn about our slave drivers. They turn a created good into an insatiable curse. That is the nature of our spiritual enemy. Many times we assume of our enemy that he just wants to do evil things to us, make our life hard, which is true. But the other way that the enemy operates is he takes a good thing and he uses it to make it into an ultimate thing. And so we find ourselves actually in bondage by something that's a created good, like we have been lured into a trap. We could have even thought, yeah, man, this thing is awesome, it's going to bring me freedom, only to find it becomes our taskmaster. So this is how it works with addiction, right? With addiction, you need more and more of the drug to get less and less of the high. And so when you started having alcohol, you're like, man, this is fun. And you might even been like, this is what like it feels like. It's such a freeing feeling or what, you know. But decades later, you can't go a day without it because you just need something to take the edge off. Or it can be something like coming into your dream job. And that's a great thing. You're fulfilling the purpose for which you've been created. But now with like every week being a 70 or 80 hour work week, it's taken everything from you. Like there's no space for anything else in your life but your work. Or like physical fitness is a great thing. Like you are stewarding the body that God has given you. But when we become overly fixated on our image, like the image that we're projecting, we're really just using it to mask our own self-loathing, or we're trying to escape some kind of insecurities. And so it's like, this is the nature of how these slave drivers work. If you can't take a break from it, it's a pretty good indication it's become your taskmaster. And so this is what's happening with Pharaoh, right? Like Pharaoh will not let the Israelites stop working. They can't stop. And so actually later, whenever Israelites are brought into freedom, God institutes the Sabbath so that they can enjoy the good things that God has created, including work. And so it's this way of saying, God's at work even when I'm not. I can trust in him. And so that's a created good. Second thing we learn from this passage about slave drivers is they create a false narrative to drown out God's narrative. This is what Pharaoh does in verse 8, right? He accuses the Israelites of being lazy. Like that's the underlying motivation here. You guys are just lazy. That's why you're asking to get out of this. And so he repeats it later on in the chapter. The Egyptians, they start to parrot this talking point. And so for some Israelites, they might be kind of getting gaslit, being like, man, am I just like lazy right now? That's why I'm trying to do this. Like they've been slaves for 400 years, but it's messed with their identity. And so that's actually this psychological phenomenon called the illusory truth effect. The illusory truth effect works in such a way that the more you hear something repeated to you that's a lie, the more likely you are to believe it. Like at first, our brain has these resistance that we hear to ideas that are foreign to us. But over time, it's just like a way of wearing us down. And this is how the enemy works, right? The enemy wears us down over time with these narratives. And sometimes this is external, right? So it could have started for you in your upbringing. Your parents or whoever was taking care of you said, you're just never going to amount to anything. And so we believed that lie. Or it could have come from our peers who we got bullied by. And we started to believe that the flaws about us were bigger than what God says about us. Or sometimes these voices can come from within. And so you're just constantly putting yourself, why did I do that? Oh, I'm never going to do this right. So it can be inflicted from within. It's a false narrative, but we believe it. As one of the most prevalent false narratives right now that's kind of like we are trained to think is that the world revolves around me. Like this is a very culturally big idea right now. And mind you, this is what Pharaoh is like. This is how he operates. Is the world's about me. If there's a desire that I have, I should be able to have that. And so that's kind of how we think. I want to just figure out what do I desire so that I can go gratify that desire and then I'll be happy. Then that leads to freedom. This is a false narrative. Jesus says, lay down your life, lay down your cross. And so these voices of the enemy, they can drown out what we think about ourselves. Not the Israelites. Think about the psychological impact of 400 years of generational slavery. That's like an intense sort of thing to think about. And so this is why when they come to this hardship that they're facing, they tragically misread what's going on here. They see this temporary setback as defeat. And so the first thing the Israelites do is they come and they make their appeal to Pharaoh, and it just gets them nowhere. And then look at what happens in verse 20. It says, when they left Pharaoh, they found Moses and Aaron waiting to meet them. And they said, may the Lord look on you and judge you. You have made us obnoxious to Pharaoh and his officials and have put a sword in their hand to kill us. And so this is the third thing we learn about our slave drivers. Our slave drivers turn our advocate into an adversary. They are fighting the very one who's been sent to free them. He's their advocate. And so actually, Moses, he ends up falling for the same exact thing. Verse 22. Moses returned to the Lord and said, why, Lord, have you brought this trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on this people, and you have not rescued your people at all. God is turned into the adversary in Moses' mind because of this hardship that they're facing. It kind of it reminds me of this video of this cat that finds itself in the middle of a rushing river stuck up on this rock. And so a rescuer comes out to help this poor little cat that's stranded in the middle of this rushing river. And so when he picks up the cat doesn't think, oh, this person's going to bring me to safety. The cat thinks, this is an attacker, this is the enemy. And so he starts clawing at the person trying to rescue him. So not only does this person who's the rescuer have to fight their way through this rushing river, they also have to fight against this cat that's clawing at them. Well, this is a little like what is happening with the Israelites right here, right? They are clawing at the one who's been sent to free them. Moses does the same thing. He is clawing at God. And sometimes this is what happens in the heat of battle. In that moment of pain, when we just start to see red, we turn the people that God has created in his image into our enemy. We fight the wrong enemy. Or we fight against God himself. We pretend that God is somehow the one that's in the wrong here. Does anybody else relate to that? That is a very real thing. And so let me just remind us of the bad news I started with today. There cannot be freedom without confrontation. It's not always going to feel good, in other words. These things that we have to face, it's not going to be fun. There's a reason that some of us procrastinate on this. But those reasons are not enough for us to avoid those confrontations. And so it means we're going to have to face the things that we feel deeply afraid of. Our most sacred of cows internally that people are going to need to talk to you about whenever it comes out. Or some of us, we're going to have to deal with some self-inflicted chains. Like we've put ourselves in this mess, and so we gotta face that. Or some of us just need to learn how to stop making excuses for why we're stuck so that we can move into God's freedom. Now listen to how God responds to Moses after his little hissy fit. This is chapter 6, verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of my mighty hand, he will let them go. Because of my mighty hand, he will drive them out of his country." In other words, whenever I'm done with Pharaoh, he's not going to just grant your request to let your people go. He's going to be asking them to leave. He's going to be begging for it by the time that I'm done with him. So in other words, friends, God is not wringing his hands over our escape plan. This is what he does. He breaks these chains that we live in. This is who God is. And so it kind of just makes me think about Houdini, okay? Houdini is this guy his famous trick is getting tied up in chains, put into this box that gets filled up with water. And so if you read about his whole technique for getting out of this, this is like his most famous calling card trick. He does it by having this breathing technique where he slows down his breath. He becomes very calm. Now, on top of that, he's practiced getting out of chains so many times that he just has a high degree of confidence. There's no amount of chains that I'm facing right now that I can't get out of. And so this is where our confidence comes, friends. In facing our chains, it's from knowing the chain breaker. This is what God does. He's done this so many times. He is not concerned about your escape plan. It is who he is. And in Jesus, we see there is no amount of darkness that his light cannot overcome. And Jesus doesn't just break us free. He does jujitsu with every attack of the enemy. Like he takes the energy of the enemy and he turns it into our good. He turns it into something that is for us. And so just think about these three things we've learned about our enemy today. Jesus reverses all of it. Jesus takes the sin of our life, the stain of sin, and he restores us to our original goodness. Jesus takes the false narrative of the enemy, and on the cross, he gives the final word, God is for you. Jesus takes every attack of the enemy where we make God into our adversary, and on the cross, when we made him our enemy, he reconciles us to God while we were still against him. And not only that, he sends his very spirit to live inside of us as our advocate every day, all day. Can I get an amen right now? Like, that is such good news right there, friends. This is who Jesus is. Jesus is the chain breaker. That's who he is. And you can live your life knowing what it's like to walk with him. So that when we face our bondage, we can face it knowing I'm with the one who brings freedom. And so as we go through this series, my prayer for us is that we would just grow, not in confidence of even being free, but we would grow in confidence of the chain breaker, that we would be walking with him. And there's just like a few time-tested practices that have been around since the inception of the church where people do this. And so these are listed on this commitment card that you have on your seat. And so this is why we have been encouraging you, fill this out. Don't wait to make a commitment to this series. You don't want to just wait to see if you feel like it. You want to dedicate these next 6 weeks to God. And so the first thing is when we worship weekly, this is the way that we hear God's voice. This is the way that we remind ourselves of our identity. We are reminded of who God is. At our tables that we meet in every week, this is where we are supported to live this out, because guess what? Facing these confrontations is hard. It's not easy to do. We need support. And third, we spend daily time with God. Friends, we leak, and so we need to be filled afresh every day. And so we've got, in this journal, we've got a Bible reading plan. And so actually what we're going to encourage you to do as a church is we're encouraging you to go through all the books of the wilderness period of the Israelites over these next 40 days. So that's Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. Those are some hard books to read. So our team has done a great job putting together some video resources that we'll have on the app and our Unchained page to help you read through that. But even if that feels like a lot, here's what I would encourage you to do. Just read one chapter of Exodus every day and journal about that. It's 40 chapters. So at the end of this period, you'll have read that. You'll be ready for the fullness of Christ's resurrection. It's going to be an amazing time. And so I want to encourage you, commit yourself to that process because God is waiting to walk through these periods of bondage, these holding patterns with us. And we can walk through knowing I can have confidence in the power of the chain breaker. So let's bow our heads and pray. Jesus, right now, we want to hear your word to us. God, what do you want us to leave with this morning? Let's leave some moments to listen for God's voice. Now, Jesus, we just bring to you whatever it is that we are in bondage with, even things that we've participated in, areas that we have missed the mark of your calling for us. Just even use your imagination to bring those areas of your life, to offer them to Jesus right now. Jesus, we want to believe what you say about us above every earthly power, above every ambition. We thank you that you have made a way on the cross for us. Thank you for reversing the curse of the enemy and doing everything for our good.